All right, let's have a prayer and we'll get going. Father God, again, we thank you that you're here in our midst by your Spirit. And Father, we just ask your Spirit to lead us and guide us tonight as we study your word. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone it's that time of the year now and you want to start thinking about reading through the Bible in a year, a Bible reading plan. And I think we're going to do it, Val and I are going to do it again this year. We didn't do it last year, at least not together. And we've done that many times. And there's all kinds of Bible reading plans on the computer. The one we use is what, Bible Gateway? If you go to Bible Gateway, you can pick, do you want to start in Genesis 1 and finish in Revelation? Or do you want to do it chronologically, which we did a couple years ago? Or do you want to do it where you have a bit of the Old Testament and a bit of the New Testament every day? There's about a half a dozen different ways of doing it. So you can pick one, and they usually use the NIV as their standard Bible, which is real easy to read. But you could choose other translations too. And that way you can read on your electronic devices, And like Val and I, we just take turns. Val will read till she's tired. And then I read till we go through it. And if we miss a day here or there, we make up for it, Or if we know we're going to be not able to read it, we'll go a couple days ahead, prepare for it. But that way, you get to the end of the year, and it's really satisfying because you've read the entire Bible, So I would advise you to think about that January 1. Start in. Okay, that's just a challenge, okay? We finished up chapter 4 last time, and so we'll find chapter 5 in Daniel, and we'll probably be able to do a couple chapters tonight, 5 and 6, because they're both narratives of a couple of stories, and it's not a tremendous amount of theological significance where we have to do a lot of research, but nonetheless they're good lessons for us. So maybe we can get a couple of them in. Okay, let's go to Daniel chapter 5. And the very first verse, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Now, this Belshazzar, all of a sudden you notice there's no Nebuchadnezzar. He's long gone. And this takes place 5 kings later. Okay, Daniel, of course, is still going. And he's probably around 80 at this time. It's just a guess. He could have been in middle 70s to into the early 80s, depending on what age he was when he came to Babylon. But Nebuchadnezzar was king for 43 years. He had a long reign. Okay, and his son's name was Evil Merodach. Evil. That's a fitting name because he was kind of an evil son. He only reigned for 2 years, and then his brother-in-law, a guy by the name of Neriglissar, murdered him, killed him, and he reigned for 4 years. And then his son, a guy by the name of Labash Marduk, he was Neriglissar's son. He reigned for 2 years. And then after him, it was a guy by the name of Nabonidus. And he murdered Labash Merodach. And he reigned for 17 years, this Nabonidus. And his oldest son, was Belshazzar. Okay, so this is 5 kings down the line in a period of, let's see, 2, 6, 8, 25, about 25 years. In a period of about 25 years, or a little less, it went through these 5 kings. So now Belshazzar is king. And he had really just become king. And this is at a time when the kingdom was, the Medes and the Persians were getting pretty rambunctious. They had gotten very strong, and they were battling them out in the territories, trying to take over Babylon. But of course, Babylon was so secure. Remember describing that city, that Belshazzar didn't have any worries. In fact, that's why he's having this big feast. Okay, he figures, there's nothing can harm him. There's no way that his city could be taken. So he's got all his lords. I mean, anybody of any significance was there. There was 1,000 there in that first verse. 1,000 of his lords. That is his nobles, his royalty, his administrators. Okay, were all there. And they were having this great feast. And it was probably a feast to Bel, their god, which lasted a week. I mean, these feasts were not just, a dinner party. Okay, these feasts lasted, and it was quite the bacchanalian revelry that went on there. It was something else, these parties. And this was the beginning of that. And he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Okay. Verse 2, and it says, while he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Now notice it says his father Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that's a word that can mean anything. That doesn't mean his immediate father. It could mean his forefather. It could mean his son in the line of kings. It could mean his grandson. It could mean, there's 8 different meanings to that word. And they just chose to put father in here. But we know from history, really good history, that Nebuchadnezzar was not his father, not his immediate father. Okay. He may have been a great grandson in some way. But at any rate, to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father had taken from the temple. Now, you would think that, how is he going to, there's 1,000 people there, plus his concubines and his wives. And by the way, the wives, that word means queens. Okay. They actually were his wives. But if he's like the normal kings of that period, they had normally one wife that was the favorite. And her offspring were the ones that were going to inherit the kingdom. The other wives were just wives. And then he had the concubines besides. Okay. But they were all there at this party, and you wonder where they were going to get them. It just turned it back up to Ezra a little bit, for just a little bit, back in chapter 1 of Ezra. He's right after Kings and Chronicles. The next book is Ezra. Ezra chapter 1. And I just wanted to show you where all these came from. Ezra, of course, the Bible is not chronological. And Ezra, actually, this book takes place after Daniel. And what's happening here is King Cyrus, who follows a little later on here, the Persian, he's allowing the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple. Okay, and here's what he says. He says in verse 5, he says, then the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and the Levites and all the spirits God had moved arose to go up and build the house of the Lord which is in Jerusalem. And all those who were around them encouraged them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock and precious things, besides all that was willingly offered. King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem and put in the temple of his gods. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Mithredath, the treasurer, and counted them out to Shebbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them: 30 gold platters, 1,000 silver platters, 29 knives, 30 gold basins, 410 silver basins of a similar kind, and 1,000 other articles. All the articles of gold and silver were 5,400. Now back in verse 9 here, that word platters, that word is really in Hebrew is chargers. What it means is wine coolers. It really is wine coolers. So you notice that it says there was 30 gold chargers and 1,000 silver chargers. So that's 1,030 right there. Okay, that they could have drank from. So there was that many vessels that were there. So that's not an improbable number that he could have brought out all of those that here back in Daniel, where he could have brought all those out. There was plenty of goblets and wine vessels for them to use. Okay, back in chapter 5. Verse 3, it says, Then they brought out the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. Gold, it means silver as well. I mean, it's just a term for the vessels. And the king, his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. Now, that's obviously, I mean, historically, this king was a pretty nasty king. And when he's doing this, I mean, it's just, I mean, the idea in his head to go get these out of the temple is just a thing to do to belittle.
Desecrate the temple.
Yeah, to desecrate the source of them, and also to kind of spite his great-great-grandfather, if you will, Nebuchadnezzar. You know, it was just an act that would be very in character with him. It says in verse 4, they drank wine and they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, wood, and stone. So in other words, instead of the temple where they came from and the God who they were built for the worship of, they were praising other gods as they drank from these. Quite sacrilegious. And in the same, well, yeah, let's go on, verse 5. It says, And in the same hour, when they drank from these, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote on the lampstand, opposite the lampstand, on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw part of the hand that wrote. So he's looking at this plastered wall, and it's opposite the lampstand, so it's lit up. Okay, so everybody could see this. And this part of a hand, it was the fingers actually, that he saw writing these words that appeared there. Now, we don't know if everybody saw it or if it was just the king, but we know the king saw it. Okay? It really bothered him. Can you imagine all of a sudden a hand appearing, writing a message? It says, verse 6, it says, Then the king's countenance changed. In other words, his face, his jaw dropped, okay, when he saw this. And his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened and his knees knocked together against each other. Now that's where we get, you know, you heard of somebody's knees were knocking, they were scared. Well, that's where this comes from. It comes from Daniel. There's a lot of little things like that come from Daniel. His knees knocking. But that one about the joints of his hips were loosened, if you really look in the Hebrew, what it really means is he peed his pants. So that's what it really means. It really indicates he couldn't hold his urine. So he sees this handwriting on the wall. His knees are knocking together, and he soils his robes. Okay, I mean this it scared the daylights out of him.
The handwriting on the wall, you probably would too.
Yeah.
The handwriting on the wall, of course, is another saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean that's
Yeah, that's
if
right.
you know if somebody's coming to something that's going to be really bad, well, the handwriting's on the wall. You know. That also comes from this passage. In verse 7, it says, The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. So that his first thought was, we gotta know what this is. And what do? You bring in the Magi, right? So that's what he did. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, Whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So in other words, he can be clothed with purple. Purple is royalty. A chain of gold around his neck, that's, you know, the wealthy. It's a valuable prize. And he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now the reason he said the third ruler is because his dad, Nabonidus, was still king. But he was off fighting battles. Okay, Nabonidus was not there. Belshazzar was the one that was just doing the duty. So that's why he said the third in the kingdom. He couldn't offer him the second, okay, because he was the second. He had to offer him the third. Okay, and that's what he was offering to these magi, if anybody could solve it. Verse 8, Now all the king's wise men came. Notice Daniel doesn't come. Now this is 25 years later, and Daniel is not even in the palace anymore. Okay, he's 80 years old or whatever. He's in his house, probably very close to there, but he's not head of the wise men anymore. In fact, all those wise men back when Daniel was in there are probably gone by now. Okay. Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Notice they asked for two things. He asked for what is the writing and what is the interpretation. Verse 9, then King Belshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. In other words, all of those lords, all of those administrators, they were astonished at Belshazzar because of the way he was reacting to this, and also they reacted to the fact that the Magi couldn't interpret this. I mean, what was this? You know. Verse 10, it says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. Now the queen, this is not his wife, okay, the queen.
Mother.
This is the queen mum, okay. She may have been Nabonidus' wife, which would have been his mother, or it could have been his grandmother. And from all of the history that I've read, it's more likely it was his grandmother. Okay, she was the queen mum. Now notice she wasn't there at the banquet, but she heard what was going on. She was there in the palace. She heard what was going on, so she went in there. Now keep in mind, this happens in this big banquet hall. And by the way, the ruins of that banquet hall are still, at least they were, very discernible back then. And then it was easily big enough to hold 1,000. And it had the remnants of plaster on the walls. So it kind of verified that this was, you know, the inside plaster was probably the banquet hall that was being used at the time. So the queen comes in, verse 10. And the queen spoke and says, O king, live forever. Typical greeting to the king. It says, don't let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Okay, so she repeats all of these things that we know already about Daniel. And Belshazzar knew it too. Okay, but he was not disposed to to seek somebody like Daniel. That was beneath his dignity. Okay, but the queen is saying, if you want to get this taken care of, do what Nebuchadnezzar would have done. Let Daniel be called. Now notice she calls him Daniel. She calls him by his Hebrew name. Okay, just Nebuchadnezzar named him Belteshazzar. Verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel, who was one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? That Daniel? And notice he's kind of belittling him, one of the captives, calling him one of the... He's not saying, are you that Daniel that was the governor of the kingdom for 40 years and the head of the Magi and all that stuff? He didn't say that. He said, are you that Daniel, one of the captives from Judah? Again, just kind of putting Daniel down. He says, I've heard of you, and that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. So he's heard of him. He's heard of Daniel. Now the wise men, verse 15, the astrologers that have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be third ruler in the kingdom. Okay, that's what he had said, that he would promise. Now he said, that'll be yours if you can do it. And then Daniel said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. In other words, you can keep your rewards, and give the ruler of the kingdom to somebody else. Keep in mind, he's an 80-year-old guy right now. He's kind of retired probably. you know, working with his people, and he just wasn't interested in this thing anymore. Back when he was with Nebuchadnezzar, it meant something, and he respected Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was even though he was a despotic ruler, he was a sensible guy, but not this Belshazzar. So he doesn't really answer him with a whole lot of respect. In other words, you can keep all that. He said, yet he said, I will read the writing to the king and make known the interpretation. But I'll do it just because you're king. Okay, you're king. Okay, you're asking, and I'll do it. Verse 18, O king, Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom. Now he's going to really lay it into the king here. He says, the Most High God, he's talking about his God, gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of that majesty he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished he executed, whomever he wished he kept alive, whomever he wished he set up, and whoever he wished he put down. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. See, so he's really laying into him. He says, you knew all of this, but there's no humility in you, Belshazzar. And, he says in verse 23, you've lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you've praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways you have not glorified. I mean, the very one that's responsible for your life and how you're living your life and what your destiny is. The very one that's responsible for it, he says, you've not glorified him. Other than these idols of gold and stone and wood and whatever. Verse 24, then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written. Those fingers were from God himself, Belshazzar. That's what he's making very clear here. And this is the inscription that was written. And there's four Aramaic words here. Many, tekel, upharsin. Notice many is repeated twice. And this is the interpretation of each word. Many, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. So many means numbered. But it's also, when you look it up, it's also a quantity of gold. Okay, it's really a mina, or 50 shekels. That's what it is. It's a mina. The number of it is 1 mina, 50 shekels. And he repeats that twice, many. Mina. Many is in Aramaic, mina is in Hebrew. Okay. Tekel is in verse 27. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Tekel is weighed, but it also is a weight of gold, and it's 1 shekel. It's 1/50th of many. And then he says, Perez, he says, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, Perez is a half of a mina. It's 25 shekels is what it is. It's a half a mina. So what he's saying here, in how he's interpreting that, he says God has numbered, weighed in the balance, and divided it. Okay, he's numbered it. In other words, you got this balance here, okay? And on one side is 50 shekels, many, okay, or a mina. And on the other side, if it's going to balance, is another 50 shekels, many. It'll balance it. But you're only worth 1 shekel, Belshazzar. You're over on this side, okay, the balance. You're only 1/50th of what you should be if you're going to balance this out. Okay, you've been weighed, okay, and it says you've been found wanting. there's not very much of you, and your kingdom has been divided. That word apartion, that's what it means, is divided. But notice he says in verse 28, it doesn't use the word apartion, which is in verse 25. He uses the word Perez. And Perez is simply the plural. It's the plural in Aramaic. And it's kind of a play on the divided, because in the plural, Perez, if you look at it, keep in mind in the Hebrew there was no vowels, okay? When it was written, it was just the consonants. So if you look at the word Perez, it's just P-R-S. If you add the A in there instead of an E, it's Paros, which is Persia. Okay? So it's kind of a play on words there. And it would have been difficult, even if they could have read this, they wouldn't have got the meaning at all anyway. And it was probably in Aramaic, all right, that it was written, but it was in a script that they couldn't understand. They couldn't even read the words, but Daniel could, because it was probably written closer to the Hebrew script, which he could understand. You know, Mina, those kinds of things. So basically, what he told them, he says, is God has numbered your kingdom, numbered your days. You've been found wanting, and your kingdom is going to be divided between the Medes and the Persians. That's what he's saying. I mean, your reign is virtually over. Now that you would think would shock him, right, when he heard that. But Belshazzar, I don't know if he really believed him or whatever, but he interpreted it so he was going to keep his promise. And he says in verse 29, Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. But that didn't last very long. Okay? Look at verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius, the Mede, received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. But what happened, of course, that was the day Babylon was taken over by the Medes. Now, remember when we described Babylon? This is very fascinating, on how a portion of the Euphrates through some sluice gates ran right through the center of town. Well, these guys that were the Persians that were battling against the Babylonians, they dug a diversion ditch into a great big marshy area, and they diverted that channel out into that marshy area, so it dropped the level down. Now you would think that there would be his guards, his people at the sluice gates in and out of the town would let him know about that. But they were all at the party. All of those, anybody of any consequence was at the party, and anybody else was very easily overcome. So all Cyrus's troops had to do was just walk in, wade in on that low water, take out a few guys there by the sluice gates, march right in, go right into the palace. They hadn't had to destroy a thing. No, fought to fire an arrow, go in and kill Belshazzar. Everybody's drunk. Nobody's armed. Take over the whole city just like that. And Belshazzar died that night. And the guy that was the general that took it over was really Darius the Mede. He had a different name in history, but it's more than likely the same guy. And Cyrus, the Persian, who was really the king over Persia, Darius was Cyrus's uncle. Okay, so they were kind of related. So at any rate, now the kingdom belongs to the Persians and the Medes. They just took it over just like that. This impenetrable kingdom was taken over in an hour. So, when God wants to do something, he does it pretty fast.
Belshazzar didn't even know he was dead.
He did. And this was prophesied. I just want to read you a little bit out of Isaiah chapter 47. There's several places where this was prophesied to happen to Babylon. Well, let me just read you this one, starting in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 1. And I'll read maybe the first 11 verses. And it's my Bible titles this, The Humiliation of Babylon. Come and sit down in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you will be no more called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind meal, remove your veil, take off the skirt, uncover the thigh, pass through the rivers. Your nakedness will be uncovered, yes, your shame will be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will not arbitrate with a man. As for our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel. Sit in silence and go in darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you will no longer be called the Lady of the Kingdoms. I was angry with my people. I have profaned my inheritance and given them into your hand. And that's what he did. Of course, God was angry with his people. And he gave them into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. He says, you have showed them no mercy. On the elderly you have laid your yoke very heavily, and you said, I shall be a lady forever, so that you do not take these things to heart, nor remember the latter end of them. Therefore hear this now, you who are given to pleasures, who dwell securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one else like me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood, they shall come on you in their fullness, because of the multitude of your sorceries, for the great abundance of your enchantments. For you have trusted in your wickedness. You have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you. And you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me. Therefore evil shall come upon you. You shall not know from where it arises, and trouble shall fall upon you. You will not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon you suddenly, which you shall not know. Now that also applies, by the way, these passages also apply to Mystery Babylon. We can, when we look at that a little more in detail, these scriptures, because in 1 hour her destruction comes as well, if you remember reading that in Revelation. So that was prophesied by Isaiah. And there's other passages that are very similar about the destruction of, about the capturing of Babylon. Let's see. Well, okay, let's go into chapter 6. Any questions about that? About the handwriting on the wall? It's pretty clear. Okay. And of course you can see it was because, you know, Nebuchadnezzar was knocked down for his humility. For his pride. And he was humbled, but he acknowledged God. But Belshazzar wasn't given that option even. Okay. Chapter 6. It pleased Darius, or Darius, however you want to pronounce that, to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom. Now satraps just means princes. Princes or governors, okay? To be over the whole kingdom. And over these, 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give an account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. So over those 120 princes, he put 3, and another word there is presidents over them. And Daniel was one of them. Okay, he had a lot of respect for Daniel. And you know, keep in mind, he's taking over a whole empire right now. The Babylonian Empire stretched a long ways. And when he takes over Babylon here, he takes over the whole thing. So he's appointing these guys to run the kingdom for him. Verse 3, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Typical Daniel. Daniel was, even at his advanced age, I mean, he was so efficient and so good at what he was doing that the king is thinking, you know, I should put this guy over everything. Okay. So that was kind of his thinking. And so, verse 4, naturally the rest of them didn't like that idea. So the governors and the satraps thought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. There were no skeletons in the closet that they could dig up anywhere against Daniel. And these men said, verse 5, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. That's about the only thing they could possibly think of, the fact that Daniel was very consistent in worshiping Jehovah and not the gods of Babylon, or now of Persia and Media. So, verse 6, these governors and satraps thronged before the king. They hatched a plan here. And they said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. Typical greeting. In verse 7, it says, all the governors of the kingdom and the administrators, the satraps, the counselors, and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, talk about something that was cooked up. And it says all the governors of the kingdom, administrators. I mean, this is really, according to what they were telling the king, this is really broadly wanted or broadly desired, that they should all worship you for 30 days. No other God, no other king, no other anything. Or you'll be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, verse 8, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. When a king in Persia or Media signed something into law, it was law. Even the king couldn't change it. He had to abide by his own law. I mean, that was not the way with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was king. If he decided to change something, he changed it. But that's not the way it was done with the Medes and the Persians. The law of the Medes and the Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. And it was written. It wasn't just a verbal decree, it was a written decree. Now, verse 10, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, so Daniel was aware, very well aware, he was one of the presidents, right? One of the three. He was aware it had been signed. He went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since the early days. Daniel had been doing this ever since he was a kid in Babylon. Getting to an open window that faced to the west, where he could face Jerusalem and get down on his knees and pray 3 times a day. That was something he did. And it was also something that was very common among the Jews. And it was really established way back with David.
So they had it before the Muslims, huh?
Pardon?
Well, the Muslims aren't even thinking yet.
Yeah.
Well,
The Muslims, supposedly,
yeah.
it depends which Muslim variety you are. They do face toward Mecca. But keep in mind that these Jews were in this captivity, and they were wanting to get back to Jerusalem, so they were always praying toward Jerusalem. And this 3 times a day, if you look at one of David's Psalms, Psalm 55, turn to Psalm 55, just to show you this. This 3 times a day, that was a morning and a noon at lunch, and then in the afternoon. It was typically 9 and 12 and 3 is when he did that. Okay, 9, 12, and 3, and using our clock, our time. Chapter 55. Let's see.
16.
6, maybe. Let's see, 6 and 7. No, I'm not in the right one here.
16 and 17.
16 and 17, is that it? Yeah, there it is. There it is. This is David, King David. He says, as for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray. I will cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. So that was something that David did also, quite consistently. Those 3 times a day. And Daniel was simply doing what his ancestors had done, a precedent that David had set. Okay, let's go back now. And in verse 10. Notice he, upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. I mean, he wasn't hiding anything. Okay, it's just wide open. Verse 11, it says, and then these men assembled. Of course, this was a trap for Daniel. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. And where did they go? They went to the king. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? And the king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, notice again, he's not one of your presidents. He's one of those captives from Judah. Does not show regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. So all of a sudden he was greatly displeased with himself. What did I do? I let these guys trick me into signing this decree. And so he was displeased with himself, and he set his heart on trying to figure out how on earth am I going to keep Daniel, who is his favorite president, who is going to make in charge of the whole kingdom? Yeah. How can I keep Daniel out of the lion's den? There must be a way here I can get around this decree. But couldn't do it. He labored until the going down of the sun, until evening, to deliver him. That didn't work. Verse 15, then these men approached the king and said to the king, know, O king, that is the law of the Medes and Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. So they're on top of the king. They're not letting them get away with this. Okay. So, verse 16, the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel, and they cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he'll deliver you. So he had some indication, because he knew what Daniel was like, and he knew what Daniel's God was like, was capable of. Okay, he said, your God will deliver you. At least that's what he was hoping. Then a stone was brought and laid in the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. A stone was brought. Now this den of lions was something you can imagine, a grating over a great big opening, and down into the lions where they would throw the food or whatever. And what they did is they put a stone over it, a big heavy stone over it, and they sealed it with their own signet rings. Signet rings were the big thing then, that had the seal of the king. And when you sealed that, you saw that was sealed, it would take a decree from the king in order to remove it. Okay. Where else do you remember a stone that was sealed? Jesus, yeah. Remember the stone was rolled in front of the tomb, and the Romans sealed that stone? Same kind of a thing. A lot of the artifacts that they're finding all over the Middle East, in Palestine and in Jerusalem, they find these signet rings. They're finding a lot of those, and they have the names of these kings on them, so they're establishing that all of these kings, and they pretty much verified almost all of these kings already. They're finding these signet rings. So anyway, the stone was sealed, so that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. So nothing is going to change this. Verse 18, now the king went to his palace, and he spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him, and his sleep went from him. In other words, there was no entertainment. Normally the king would have entertainment every night. And he says he was fasting. Now when that says fasting, that doesn't mean just food and water, okay? That means no concubines. It means none of that kind of activity at all, okay? That's what fasting meant in that. No. So anyway, he just went to bed. And it says his sleep went from him. In other words, he couldn't sleep, knowing that Daniel was in the lion's den. Verse 19. Then the king arose very early in the morning, and he went in haste to the den of lions. The first thing he did, the minute there was any sign of daylight, is he headed toward that den. And when he came to the den, he cried out in a lamenting voice to Daniel. In other words, a very sorrowful voice, a cracked voice. Okay, he was very, very upset. In a lamenting voice to Daniel. Now keep in mind, the stone was still there. And the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? So he's listening now, waiting to hear a voice. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. I mean, the king had to be super happy when he heard that. He says, my God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. So God sent his angel, his messenger. And probably was the same messenger that was in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It may have been Jesus himself in his pre-incarnate form, as the messenger of Yahweh. And he shut the lions' mouths. So he just, that was not a big thing for God to do, to shut the lions' mouths. And the reason he did it, according to Daniel here, is because I was found innocent before him. In God's judgment, I was innocent and did not deserve this kind of treatment. And also, O king, I've done no wrong before you. Now think about that statement for a minute. He said, I didn't do any wrong before you. Now wait a minute, he violated the king's decree, didn't he? But he said, I didn't do any wrong before you. And the king obviously bought that because he was aware of what God had just done. And it wasn't out of no respect for the king that he did that. It was just that he respected his God above the decree of the king. Okay? And in that, Daniel says, I didn't do you any wrong. And the king pretty much agreed. He knew that this was a trap anyway. You know? And because, look in verse 23, the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. No injury. I mean, it wasn't even a claw mark on his clothes. Okay? He was just fine. And look at verse 24. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them in the den of lions. Them, their children, and their wives. And the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever hit the bottom of the den.
That's the deal Jesus made with them. Said, if you spare Daniel, I'll give you a whole bunch tomorrow.
A whole bunch tomorrow.
You can fill right out.
Well, that was a tradition. Really, that was a tradition back in those times. I mean, if you found someone who was guilty of an abhorrent crime, the whle family, because that individual probably influenced those around him, so they're all going into the lion's den.
I'm just thinking,
And those men were surely those other two presidents. Okay, the other ones that we don't know who the rest or how many of them there was, but it was at least those two and their families that were thrown to the lions.
That's how they had population control.
yeah, with innocent children.
Right. There's a couple of verses. Turn to Psalms chapter 7. There's a principle here. In Psalms chapter 7, start in verse 14. It says, behold, the wicked brings forth iniquity, yet he conceives trouble and brings forth falsehood. He made a pit and dug it out, and has fallen into the ditch which he has made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown. Okay, that's a principle. You're going to fall into the pit that you dug for somebody else, you're going to fall into it. The trap you made for someone else, you're going to fall into it. Go to Proverbs, the next book, and look at Proverbs 11, chapter 11. In verse 8. Now Daniel was certainly a righteous man. And verse 8 says, the righteous is delivered from trouble, and it comes to the wicked instead. Okay. There's a lot of verses like that. You remember in Esther when Haman built the gallows to kill Mordecai?
You got hung on.
Yeah. He got hung on his own gallows that he built. He built the gallows to hang Mordecai, and he wound up getting hung on it himself. That's the same thing that happened here. These guys had it in their hearts to conspire against Daniel. Yeah, well, they got what they had planned for Daniel. They got it. Okay, let's go back to Daniel here. Or in verse 25. Then King Darius wrote, after he killed these other guys, he said, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, that is on the land, in this kingdom, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. In other words, they got to show a lot of respect to Daniel's God. He's not saying they got to believe in him or follow him, but they better respect the God of the Jews. They better respect Jehovah, Daniel's God. Tremble and fear, that's what it means. For he is the living God. In other words, he's not a God of stone and wood and, all these idols. He's the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will endure until the end. Now he's quoting way back from what the queen had told Belshazzar. His dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. He's delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. There's a reference to this in Hebrews. You should be aware of. In the Hall of Faith, when Hebrews in chapter 11, when it's going through all of the Old Testament saints who are commended for their faith, in verse 33, he's kind of summing up those that he didn't name. He says, well, let me read verse 32 so you got it in context. He says, and what more shall I say? For the time will fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. Of course, Daniel was a prophet, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. Okay, that's referring to what happened to Daniel. Stopped the mouth of lions. And there's another principle here we should be aware of. Go up to 1 Peter, Hebrews, James, 1 Peter. A couple books ahead. And go to 1 Peter chapter 5. This is a verse I'm sure most of you, or not all of you, are familiar with. Let me start in verse 6. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6. Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whomever he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, and so on. But your adversary, talking about Satan, the god of this world, he walks about like a roaring lion. Roaring meaning hungry. Okay? Roaring lion is a hungry lion. Seeking whoever he may devour. So we need to be aware. We need to be alert. We need to be on our toes. But we have all that we need. Okay, we don't have to sweat him, because greater is he that's in us than he that's in the world. Okay, but he walks about as a roaring lion. Okay, these lions couldn't devour Daniel. And that last verse now in Daniel chapter 6. It says, that's verse 28. It says, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. After Darius, after Darius died, he was Cyrus's uncle, then Cyrus actually moved into Babylon and took over and was running the kingdom from there. Daniel lived into the reign of Cyrus a few years, at least 3 years into the reign of Cyrus before he finally died. But Cyrus is the one that permits them to go back after the 70 years were over, and sent the Jews back to Israel to rebuild their temple. Gave them the gold and gave them all the stuff. Maybe we'll look at that a little bit next time. We'll have a little more time to explore that, because that was prophesied in Isaiah that he would do that. But we're running out of time now. Cyrus is one of the good kings, really good kings, and Cyrus the Persian. In fact, he's revered in Persia today, Iran. Cyrus is revered as one of the best, the historical kings that Persia has ever had. Okay. It says Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So other than that little stint in the den of lions, Daniel really prospered from the day he got there. Okay, all the way up until he died an old man, but used mightily of God. And we're going to read a lot more when we start getting into these next chapters. These next chapters are going to start to get really, really intense as to prophecy. Chapter 7 begins it. After 8 really gets into it. 9, 10, 11 gets very detailed, and 12 gets unbelievably detailed. Okay, so starting from here now, it's going to get more and more into the prophecy of things yet to come for us. Okay, so read chapter 7 for next time. I don't know how far we'll get. I don't know if we'll get into chapter 8. Probably not. We'll for sure have chapter 7 next time. Okay. Any questions on any of that? Any comments, questions? Okay, Father God, again, we thank you for your word. And we thank you for men like Daniel. And we just pray, Father, that we will continue in your word. I just pray, Father, that this new year that's coming, that we all continue to study your word, that we continue to grow, that we continue to look on the one who saved us, whose image we should be trying to copy, and that's your Son Jesus. These things I pray in his name. Amen.